Hello, everyone. This is Michael Berry, Director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA, and this is the continuation of our CCS online speaker series, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Liz Carter. Liz is a doctoral candidate here in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA, working on Chinese linguistics. She is also a prolific author, editor, translator. She is the author of a book called Let 100 Voices Speak on the Internet Culture in China. She's also the co-author of a book called The Grass Mud Horse Lexicon, published by China Digital Times. She, in a former incarnation, was managing editor for Tea Leaf Nation and is currently a contributor to the LA Review of Books China channel. She's also translated numerous books, articles, and publications, and we're just so happy that she has returned to the Center of Chinese Studies. She was part of one of our CCS Scholars Forum several months back, and today she has a kind of bigger forum to share her research on the Chinese internet. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Liz. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your quarantine to share your thoughts and reflections on Chinese internet culture.
Thanks, Professor Berry, for the introduction. I always feel after Professor Berry introduces me, I should say, please lower your expectations by at least 50%. Today, I'm just going to be giving kind of an overview of social media in People's Republic of China. Some of it is content that I covered in my book, and some of it is things that happened afterwards. So without further ado, let me set up my PowerPoint here. Okay. I believe I will set it up and then share screen first. So you can see it, right?
Yes.
Do you see the presenter's view?
I see presenter's view.
Okay. Let me, sorry, this is the first time I've done a PowerPoint like this remotely. I have a 2-monitor setup, so it's a little tricky. Okay, I'm guessing you're still seeing the presenter's view.
Yes.
How about now?
Now we have appropriate view.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for bearing with me. So the title of the presentation is Wired China from Weibo to WeChat. There's some about Weibo, and then we'll move towards talking about WeChat later in the presentation. So basically, I'll cover how the internet came to China in its early days, the relationship between the government and social media, which includes but is not limited to censorship, what the transition into more use of WeChat means for social media, and a bit about future directions of surveillance and censorship. So I like to ask in this presentation, when was the internet invented? We can't do kind of like a live poll right now, but it really reveals what people think about as the internet. So is it the thing we use to connect with people? Is it the hardware, the software, how we use those things together? You know, there's aspects of it that are publicly and privately owned, but basically kind of the foundations were laid in the 60s and 70s. By the 80s, which is when the internet first came to China, it was kind of mainly being used to connect institutions together. And by the 90s, it was being more used to connect, or for individuals to connect with each other. But what does that mean for China? So this is a graph, and I've taken the data from CNNIC, which is a PRC government institution which collects this kind of information a couple of times a year. It tracks the growth of the population of internet users in the PRC, and it's in millions. So you can see In 2006, it was about 150 million. And by March 2020, it's usually released the beginning of the year, but obviously, there were some delays this year due to a global pandemic. It's right up there at 900 million. And as you can see, this also tracks mobile internet users as a percentage of internet users in total. And as of 2020, the two groups are almost totally overlapping circles in a Venn diagram. So you can see how the internet is becoming more mobile, and it's becoming something that the majority of people in the PRC do use. However, if you compared internet penetration with the US, you might see a slightly different picture. So in 2006, 70%, roughly 70% of the US population used the internet. And that was when it was about between 100 and 200 million in the PRC. And then as of 2019, the level of internet penetration in the PRC is still below what it was about 15 years ago in the US. And this has a lot to do with internet infrastructure, especially in rural areas, and different definitions of what is an internet user. But you can see the lines are still converging. The World Bank doesn't have data for the US after 2017, which is why that chart kind of ends where it ends. But what is the internet used for? I mean, is it the same thing in both countries? You could say it's used to access information. For instance, what is the weather today? What's the exchange rate between these things? How do you spell maintenance? The various things we use it for a day-to-day basis, access to services, Postmates, whatever it is you're using for grocery delivery, all of those things rely on the internet. There's also entertainment, communication, and of course, education. So I pulled this chart also off CNNIC and just translated a couple of the more interesting categories. So this compares the growth over the past 2 years in the use of the internet for certain applications. So as you can see, messaging grew from 95.6 to 99.2%. The almost virtually everyone who uses the internet in the PRC will use it for messaging. That is the #1 use of it. Online video also grew substantially, and this includes TikTok, which is very popular in PRC as well. Online payment grew quite a bit. Search engine remained steady. Online news dipped a little bit. And as you can see, the most dramatic growth from 2018 to 2020 is the use of the internet for online education, which is something I'm sure you can all empathize with. So now that we've talked a little bit about kind of how many people use the internet and what's it used for, I want to get into censorship. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the term the Great Firewall. It's kind of a catch-all term to describe whatever it is that blocks people who are physically in the PRC from seeing a lot of the internet that's outside of the PRC. So this is just a list of some of the websites, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, WordPress, eBay, that are blocked, which means if you try to access them in the PRC, usually you'll get 404 not found, or you just won't be able to load the page. This is also a slightly more updated list of some of the things that are blocked, just to give you an idea if you've never used the internet when you're in the PRC. Basically all of the major messaging services besides WeChat, so WhatsApp, Telegram, KakaoTalk, which is popular in South Korea, Line, which is popular in Japan, Facebook Messenger, social media like Instagram, YouTube, Pinterest, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and Tinder. And then down here you have Netflix, Vimeo, YouTube, all the major kind of video sites besides their Chinese counterparts. And something that's particularly difficult for a lot of people who are trying to complete their degrees in the US or other places is cloud storage or productivity sites like Dropbox, Google Docs, Google Drive. It can be difficult to access these without what's called a virtual private connection, VPN. So what do people do if they don't access these sites? Well, there's domestic counterparts for almost all of these companies or these applications or websites. So Google, actually Baidu always had a much larger percentage of the market than Google, and it is the major player in the search engine market in PRC. Weibo kind of takes the place of Twitter, which was blocked, especially after it was blocked, Weibo became much more popular. WeChat is used kind of in, it says it's a Facebook equivalent, but it's the equivalent of a lot of different apps. So it has Instagram-like features, it has Yelp-like features. We'll get into WeChat later. But YouTube, kind of the same market that YouTube would have in other parts of the world, Youku and iQIYI and several other video streaming services have a bit of a monopoly on that. So we can talk about censorship as meaning, you know, these websites are blocked, so you have to use these other websites. But that's kind of a very simplistic understanding of censorship. It's much more nuanced and complicated than that. So we talked about all the things you can do with the internet. It's all the different restrictions to those uses of the internet. So restriction of access to information, restriction of access to services, restriction of certain entertainment content, and restriction of certain kinds of communication. And also surveillance. That's kind of the cherry on top. So methods of censorship include, as I mentioned, blocking these websites, but also deleting content, banning users, banning search terms, jailing users, cracking down on VPNs, and shutting down the internet. So as you can see, it's a combination of kind of the harder approaches, such as completely blocking a website, or you allow a website to be accessible, but you require the person running the website to monitor the content, for instance, and delete anything that violates some kind of standard. You can ban users who violate kind of that standard. You can even jail users who, for these kind of like online speech events. And you can, there's VPNs, which I mentioned you can use to access kind of the outside internet. There's been repeated crackdowns on VPNs, so it's more and more difficult kind of to get around the Great Firewall. And then finally, there's shutting down the internet, which sounds extremely dystopian and unlikely, but it actually happened in Xinjiang in 2009 for a period of about 10 months between 2009 and 2010. Following riots, the entire province of Xinjiang, you could not access the internet. You had to leave the province kind of to check your email. So it's worth mentioning just because it's kind of the nuclear option, but it is and it has been used and could be used again. And I always like to mention when I talk about the Great Firewall that it's not just kind of the, you know, amorphous Chinese authorities or Chinese government who is doing this. There's US companies who have been complicit kind of and helping the both infrastructure construction of the Great Firewall. Also, the Golden Shield Project is the official name for much of the infrastructure development that's considered the Great Firewall. And Yahoo also famously shared the emails of an activist, and based on kind of those divulged emails, he was put in jail for some time. So I just want to show a short video of, if I can find it here. Right, so this is the video that's kind of gives a little bit more of an explainer about the technical aspects of censorship. And it's a video by a YouTube account called Huixingzhen, or Paperclip, that does kind of explainer videos, like how does this work. I've subtitled it in English, but one thing you should know kind of that will help the video make sense is that the example that's used in the video is about the assassination of the brother of Kim Jong-un. So Kim Jong-nam was assassinated in 2017, and this was kind of a sensitive political event, and a lot of commentary on it was censored. So with that said, I will just play the video.
中国网民第一次发现敏感词的存在是在2000年的 QQ 聊天室，用于结交陌生朋友的聊天室功能，让敏感内容第一次有了大规模传播的可能。因此，近词表出现了。近词表的规则相当粗暴，只要文本内容包含禁用词，则无法发送，或发送后仅字迹可见。直到今天，微信仍是如此。好在微信环境相对封闭，审查级别并不高。多伦多大学一份2016年10月发布的报告中，只发现178个禁词，且仅针对中国大陆手机号码。而在 Web 2.0时代，随着博客、论坛、社交网络开始成为主流产品，任何信息都有可能在一夜之间传遍全网，传统禁词方案的缺陷开始暴露出来。首先，词库只能做到精准匹配，无法处理对原词的演绎。假设金正恩为敏感词，那么可以演绎出三胖、星以及英文、拼音、字符版本的几十个替代词，甚至直接用金以指代，而这些词显然无法被近词表囊括。另一方面，许多敏感内容是事件，无法仅用单个词描述。以金正男机场遇刺为例，需要机场、金正男、遇刺其中2个词同时出现，才能触发清除机制，这就给了其中单个词相当大的替换空间，如机场金大胖、胖熊机场一日游，都可以让人联想到该事件。面对这些问题，各种消灭敏感内容的计算机算法开始被研究出来。分词是分析文本的第一步，传统的正向最大匹配法，即从左到右扫描文本，将匹配成功的词切分，直到无法匹配为止。但这种方法并不可靠，如一台独立服务器就还是会被分为一台独立服务器。为了解决歧义问题，需要对大量真实语料进行统计，计算每个词的出现概率，再计算不同分词方案下的总概率。在这个例子中，因为例作为词的出现概率极低，因此一台独立服务器的概率将明显高于一台独立服务器。更进一步，还可以计算2个词同时出现的概率，以得到更精确的分词结果。今天的分词算法可以成功识别插入特殊符号的敏感词，而配合扩展词表，也可以处理以同音字或拼音替代的敏感词。但对于联想类敏感词和事件类敏感内容，还需要其他算法的加持。贝叶斯方法就是其中之一。1763年，英国学者托马斯·贝叶斯提出了著名的贝叶斯公式。贝叶斯方法的核心在于通过已知事件的概率计算未知事件的概率。还是以金正男机场遇刺为例，假设抽取10万条包含机场的文本，其中7万条为正常内容，3万条为需要清除的敏感内容，则正常评论的概率是70%，敏感评论的概率为30%。以遇刺为例，假设在7万条正常内容中有70条遇刺，即出现概率为0.1%，而3万条敏感内容中有300条遇刺，即出现概率为1%。遇刺一词出现的总概率为0.37%。那么一条提到了机场的内容里出现了遇刺，该内容是敏感内容的概率是多大呢？将上面的结果带入贝叶斯公式中，可以算出概率为81.1%。按此方法可以计算出每个词的敏感概率，根据这个公式就可以计算出该文本为敏感内容的期望，再根据实际情况设定阈值进行处理。以金大胖在机场遇刺为例，根据金大胖、机场和遇刺3个词的敏感概率，可以计算出这句话是敏感内容的概率为93.9%。贝叶斯方法的缺陷是需要大量语料数据作为其鲜艳概率的支撑，但在深度学习算法逐渐成熟的今天，距离完全消灭敏感内容的最后屏障就是样本的数量。为了实现这一伟大目标，官方也许可以定期举办敏感内容放心说等活动，号召人民群众一起为消灭敏感词贡献数据。我是吴宗磊，如果你喜欢本期节目，请转发支持我们。你可以在微博。
So that video kind of dives into the technical aspect of it, and that's just one technical aspect of it. There's all sorts of software and technologies that have kind of been developed to handle the tasks and requirements of censorship. But I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the stages of censorship. So there's what I consider the rough, refined, and commercialized stages that go with kind of the first introduction of the internet, the development of the internet, and kind of Web 2.0. So the rough stage was the initial laws. And first it was just laws that had to do with other things like publishing being applied to the internet. Gradually there were laws drafted that were dealing specifically with the internet kind of as a platform for speech through the late 90s. And these were kind of like a wild west of the internet, because a lot of the people drafting the laws, I guess, didn't really use the internet. The internet was so new, no one knew about no one could really fathom what its potential would be or its scale or scope. So it was enforced also sporadically. It was much easier to access a lot of different kinds of content and sites. There was less surveillance at the time. As infrastructure developed in the 2000s, especially with the Golden Shield Project and kind of government-backed funding development like that, censorship became more refined. So to determine which websites, there became more refined ways of determining which websites would be blocked. Certain kinds of search terms would be blocked. Surveillance also picked up during this time. And then after this, in the 2000s and 2010s, there was a lot more outsourcing to private companies. So the government would say to private companies operating in the PRC, you have to maintain a certain standard on your website. These terms, filter and censor these terms and topics. There would be kind of more frequent directives about what kind of content was to be erased or blocked. And then the companies themselves became responsible for a lot of the day-to-day kind of censorship work. So companies, for instance, like Weibo, would employ in-house censorship teams to deal with a lot of things that previously might have been the government's responsibility. I would argue that these three stages have kind of come to an end, and now we are in a fourth stage, which is the normalization of censorship. So what does that mean? It's perceived as inevitable. It's enforced mainly through intimidation, deterrence, and internalization. It's maintained by leveraging pre-existing norms, reframed as necessary for the greater good, and conflated with national identity. So for instance, take enforced mainly through intimidation, deterrence, and internalization. Just knowing that you could potentially be jailed or have your account deleted for saying something or arguing a certain point makes you much less likely to do that, because I don't know about you, but if I've posted 10,000 times on this website, I've invested a lot of my time in that. I don't want it to just disappear overnight, much less go to jail. Maintained by leveraging pre-existing norms. So you wouldn't want to do something that could get your family in trouble, is basically the simplest way of putting that. That could get your friends in trouble, that could get your company in trouble. Then you could be blamed for being a troublemaker, and bad things could happen to people you care about. So the pre-existing norm of caring about people around you, of being a responsible employee, all of that is leveraged to make sure that you kind of abide by the rules that say, don't say this certain thing. Even though the rules may be ambiguous, that actually makes it even harder to determine where the line is and encourages even more self-censorship. Reframed as necessary for the greater good. So there's all sorts of arguments for why certain censorship is okay. In the US, the kind of standard that's often touted is a clear and present danger. So that's the kind of the threshold for deciding if the government can tell you not to say something. You wouldn't shout fire in a crowded movie theater because it poses a clear and present danger. Other countries have other standards for what they determine to be unacceptable or illegal speech. And then finally, conflated with national identity. If you criticize a system, it could be perceived as not being patriotic. So there's all sorts of books out there about this. I just wanted to point out a few in case this is a topic that you're interested in doing more research on. Margaret E. Roberts, who worked on the Harvard team that did some of the initial studies in reverse engineering censorship, has the book she's come out with called Censored. Contesting Cyberspace in China, The Power of the Internet in China, by Guobin Yang. Blocked on Weibo, which deals specifically with search terms, looking at different terms on Weibo. So these are all good to check out if you want to do further reading. So different scholars kind of have different ways of kind of drawing analogies about censorship. We've talked about the Great Firewall, which draws on the analogy of the Great Wall. Like the Great Wall, it's not just one thing, it's a combination of a number of things. It's kind of like has this significance. The Great Wall was built during different eras. It doesn't all connect at this point. The Great Firewall is also kind of different censorship methods that all work for the purpose of censorship, but may not necessarily be part of the same coherent whole. There's also the anaconda and the chandelier. You know, if there's a snake up in the chandelier, just by the fact that it's there, you're going to want to stay away. So that's the deterrence. Not knowing when it's going to strike makes you more likely to be careful, kind of guard what you say. There's the idea of the gilded cage. So the anaconda and the chandelier was something Perry Link famously said. The gilded cage is another analogy that points out that the Chinese internet can actually be a very fun place. So there's a lot of entertainment, there's a lot of things you can do online in the PRC that makes it more bearable, you know, that you can't use it to access Facebook or, you know, different kinds of foreign media. So while it is a restricted space, there's also, you know, some upsides. It's more like Brave New World in that sense than 1984 sometimes. And then finally, there's the analogy of the pressure valve system, the idea that censorship is something that's not static. It can be loosened and tightened depending on different needs. So this is kind of coming to the analogy that I made in my book. It's a little bit of historical background. There's the 100 Flowers campaign, which took place in the 1950s. So it was a campaign in which Mao Zedong, the leader at the time, said, the policy of letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend is designed to promote the flourishing of the arts and the progress of science. So this was said in 1956. This was a time when intellectuals were encouraged to offer criticism and their own ideas about how things should be run. You know, the PRC was just founded less than 10 years prior, and it was a movement in which, you know, previously a more tight space for discourse was opened. But in the next year, in 1957, was the beginning of the anti-rightist campaign. So Mao Zedong said, the attack from the right has not reached its height. They are terribly excited. We will let them be crazy for a while yet, let them reach their peak. So some people have speculated that the 100 Flowers campaign was a deliberate move to loosen the space to make people more able to share criticism for multiple reasons. One, that information and input was desperately needed at the very beginning of the PRC. Ideas about the economy, society, politics, governance. And two, it helped identify people who would potentially become dissidents or critics, who were then subsequently targeted in the anti-rightist campaign. So that is one of the reasons that I chose the title for this book, Let 100 Voices Speak, because there was a period of time on Weibo where there was much more free and open discussion. And I don't think that was an accident. I think, you know, there's always going to be times when there's more or less control over what's acceptable to be said, but many of the people who spoke out during this time period were subsequently targeted, and many of them did end up in jail. However, you know, that period of time did provide the government with a lot of information about the sources of public discontent, ideas for reform, what could be tolerated, what could not be tolerated. So when you think about kind of the internet as a pressure valve, if you stop people from speaking out or criticizing policies or people, that discontent doesn't just go away. You know, it doesn't, you cannot erase that, you can just kind of block it. So if you think of it as a pressure valve, periodically, you know, people will become upset or dissatisfied enough that they will still say something. So it's something, if you look back over history, just because the internet is new doesn't mean policies related to censorship are new. Everything becomes new in a way, but it's important to kind of ground it in terms of what has happened in the past. So what are some of the things that did happen on Weibo during that time period when it was kind of a platform for more public, open discussion? Some even consider it kind of a public square. So one of the primary things that's often cited, and I talk about more in the book, is taking down corrupt officials. So individual corrupt officials were kind of exposed on Weibo. And for instance, on the left here, you see Watch Brother. So different pictures of this local official were discovered online in which he was wearing various different expensive watches. And people online did the math and said there's no way he could afford all of those Rolexes if he's really just getting his income as a local official. The one on the left is Lei Zhengfu. He was a local official who was notoriously so wealthy that real estate developers could no longer afford to bribe him. And so they set a honey trap for him and recorded him basically having sex with someone they'd sent to kind of do the sting operation, and then threatened to expose him in that way. It came to light that he had been involved in all of this kind of embezzlement, and once it was exposed online, he was punished. So a lot of kind of lower level officials did get taken down due to outpouring of public opinion on the internet. There was also protests against chemical plants, NIMBY protests, and these kind of gained awareness for their cause on Weibo in different places around China because people felt that the plants would cause pollution in their hometowns. Monitoring of air quality was a big way that Weibo was used to push for policy change. People would post pictures. This is 2 images of Beijing, the CCTV tower. On different days, air pollution was fairly bad, and the US Embassy was tweeting or actually posting on Weibo it monitored from, I think, the 3rd Ring Road in the city, and then posted the figures about air pollution every day. And eventually, I believe it was removed, but people continued to post the information on Weibo. And it was also kind of the birth of, or perhaps not the birthplace, but a place where counterculture and anti-censorship language thrived. So a good example is Caonima, which is the grass mud horse, is kind of a symbol of anti-censorship. If you pronounce it a different way, it means fuck your mother. But in order to get around automated censorship, changing the 3 characters into grass, mud, horse helps the term be posted, whereas initially it might be just filtered out. Kind of the same as putting an asterisk when you're typing curse words. There's a whole group of other mythical creatures or characters that come about because of this kind of wordplay. And this kind of wordplay became more and more developed over the course of censorship in Weibo. There's also rights activism happened on Weibo. So this is Xu Zhiyong, who is now been detained again, but he was active on social media and on the internet, kind of campaigning for a citizens' rights movement. So lawyers, especially rights defense lawyers, use the platform to raise awareness of their cases and their cause, and promoted what was called same city dinners, which were a form of kind of community networking activism. And they used platform Weibo as well as other platforms. However, this period did not last forever. So this is Xue Manzi, or Charles Xue, who is a US citizen living in China, who was kind of one of the first public victims of the crackdown. So there was a period in which Weibo was a, relatively speaking, a free forum for discussion with censorship, but quite ineffective or sporadic censorship. And then following that, there was a period of a harsher crackdown that first targeted some of the what are called big Vs, or verified users who had a lot of influence on the platform. So this man was known for tweeting or for posting on Weibo critically of the government and policy and various other issues. And he was arrested on charges of soliciting prostitutes in Beijing, where he lived. And then a video of him making a confession was broadcast on national television. In that confession, he said, I misused my position as an influencer online, I should not have been so critical and seeking fame in that way. So many people felt, because of the content of that forced confession, that the reason he was arrested was not the actual charge that he was charged with, but rather that he was a very vocal critic online. So following the targeting of the big Vs, or kind of the influential public opinion leaders, there was a series of other laws that were passed, including one that deemed that any rumor, malicious rumor that was retweeted more than 500 times could be penalized. So for instance, if I tweeted something that the government deemed to be a rumor, and then it gained a lot of traction, a lot of people were retweeting it, I could be liable, I could face criminal charges because of that. So the phrase "to be 500'd" came about to mean it could be another way that the government could target people who are critical of policies or say things the government does not want them to say online. So what is a rumor? What is fact? If the government is ultimately the only authority to decide that, then the government has authority to police any kind of speech. Now that we've talked about Weibo, which was the popular social media platform on which all this was happening, I want to move a little bit more to Weixin. And at this point, I also want to make a distinction between Weixin and WeChat, which is a lot of people do believe they're the same thing. And to an extent, they're a similar platform. But Weixin, as I talk about it, refers to Weixin accounts that are registered to PRC mobile numbers. Accounts that are registered to non-PRC numbers initially have a different set of requirements and abilities on the platform. So there's things you can do if it's registered to a Chinese or PRC mobile number that you cannot do if it's registered, let's say, to an LA number. And I recently learned that it doesn't matter if it's initially registered to a PRC number and you change it to be registered to a non-PRC number, it's still subject to the PRC number rules and restrictions. So WeChat, sorry, I should back up a little bit and explain what WeChat is for people who don't use it. It's like kind of like a messaging / social media / all-in-one app with 1.16 billion monthly active users as of December 2019, according to Tencent's earnings report, which they're required to do as a listed company. WeChat and Weixin are not exactly the same thing. I was not able to find out exactly what percentage of users are considered Weixin users and what are considered WeChat users. I don't think that's information that they provide. However, I do want to show this video the New York Times did that explains a little bit more, rather than me just talking at you, about what WeChat can do and why it's such kind of like an all-encompassing app.
If you are sitting in the United States or Europe right now, you've probably never used a Chinese app. But the reality is, if you want to know how the internet will develop, China, the land once known for its cheap ripoffs, has actually become a guide to the future. You know, the internet is the internet, but for China, the internet is more like an intranet. It's largely walled off from the Western world by this incredibly complex system of filters and blocks that we call the Great Firewall. And basically, the Great Firewall blocks any foreign site the Communist Party doesn't think it can control. So that means there is no Facebook, no Twitter, no Google. Instead, what filled the internet vacuum was a generation of Chinese copycats that have grown into huge companies. So for Google, you had Baidu. For YouTube, you had Youku. For Twitter, you had Sina Weibo, and the list goes on and on. It's almost as if the Chinese internet is a lagoon as an aside to the greater ocean of the internet. And in that lagoon, there are these swamp monster apps that bear some resemblance to the creatures in the ocean, but are mutated in some ways because they evolved in a different kind of environment. But things have started to shift in the sense that before, no one outside of the lagoon really cared about the swamp monsters. But now, all of a sudden, some of the features they've developed are so amazing that Western apps are trying to copy them. And the greatest example of this is WeChat. WeChat is an example of, for lack of a better word, a super app. It's a Swiss Army knife that basically does everything for you. It's your WhatsApp, Facebook, Skype, and Uber. It's your Amazon, Instagram, Venmo, and Tinder. But it's other things we don't even have apps for. There are hospitals that have built out whole appointment booking systems. There are investment services. There are even heat maps that show how crowded a place is, be it your favorite shopping mall or a popular tourist site. The list of services goes on basically forever. But it's not the variety of things you can do on WeChat that makes it so powerful. It's the fact that they're all in one app. So why does that matter? Hypothetically, imagine you're sitting at home and one day you notice your corgi is dirty. You open WeChat, hit a few buttons, and a few hours later a man shows up at your door with some shampoo and a big vacuum. Your dog gets cleaned and he looks great. You take a photo, you share it with your friends, and tag the dog cleaning business. You haven't left the app. Your friend who likes Hello Kitty and works a boring office job is slacking off at work and looking at WeChat. She sees the photo of your clean corgi. She decides she wants her poodle clean. She clicks the tag on your photo and orders the same service. Within seconds, the man with the big vacuum is on his way to her house. She pays him, and he's happy because he got paid instantly on WeChat. She starts chatting with you to thank you. Neither of you have left the app. While chatting, she tells you about a new hip noodle joint. She says, you have to come. It's a schlep, but you accept. She orders food while still at her desk. You order a taxi. She pays for the food. On the way to her house, the man with the big vacuum invests the money he earned from both of you into a wealth management product that's probably a little too risky. Neither of you nor the man with the big vacuum have left the app. Both of you arrive and the app tells the kitchen you're there. Your WeChat profile photo pops up on the wall. It's an old photo from the year you had that weird part in your hair. Of course she makes a comment. Your food is served. You notice your meat is a bit overcooked, so you snap a photo and post a disparaging restaurant review. You're already on your phone and you remember you still owe your friend money because she paid. You transfer her money. Neither of you, the man with the big vacuum, nor the restaurant have left the app. At the restaurant, there are no menus, there are no waiters, there is no cashier. There is only WeChat. By rolling so many functions into one single app, it's altered the concept of virality. It's no longer just videos or images or tweets that can go viral. It's a dog washer, noodles, all sorts of companies and products that get the push of a social network. Here in China, that network is 700 million people.
So the analogy of the one ring is a little dark, but that kind of demonstrates all the different things you can do with WeChat, and it's a very non-exhaustive list. So in terms of censorship, how is censorship on WeChat different from censorship on Weibo? Weibo is an open social network. It's much more like Twitter in that you can search for things people have said, you can see what are the trending topics across the platform. You know, it's all kind of accessible to you. You can see what other people are talking about outside of your immediate circle. With WeChat, it's more of a closed social network. You mainly see people who are in your friends circle or on your timeline. It's people you know personally, public accounts you subscribe to, but you can't, for instance, see, oh, what's the #1 trending term across all of WeChat? That's just non-accessible. It's more strongly enforced real name registration. So real name registration has always been a push to link someone's online accounts to their real identity via their ID number or their mobile number, which is linked to their ID number, so that it's always possible to track for law enforcement to track who is it, whose name is, Nick Suck 278. What is this person's real name? Where do they live? There's account blocking. So WeChat is so widely used to connect with your family, to text message, to do all sorts of things that the threat of having that account blocked is much kind of more intimidating than the effect of having your Weibo account blocked. If you don't have WeChat, how are you gonna send audio messages to your mom? There's all sorts of, you could text, but most people use WeChat much more than they text. There's also content screening. And I wanted to highlight this recent study that's been done by a great team at Citizen Lab on different kinds of content screening for different kinds of WeChat accounts. So they did a very strong, broad database study on how international users, those that are registered, the accounts registered to non-PRC numbers, unwittingly build up the censorship apparatus. And I won't go into detail here, but basically, sometimes you can send a message over WeChat and then the other person doesn't receive it. So in theory, two international or non-PRC users or accounts on WeChat are not subject to that same censorship, but there's technical processing of that content that helps determine for the other accounts what is sensitive content, which images and terms should be banned. So the other side kind of censorship and blocking and account banning is kind of the carrot to the stick. So the social credit system, which is still in the process of being kind of rolled out, there's actually a number of different social credit systems that are kind of in various stages of development. I'll show this South China Morning Post video on the social credit system, but it's important to keep in mind that, you know, there's rewards as well as punishments, rewards for kind of adhering to guidelines for not being a troublemaker that incentivize people to stay away from those sensitive topics. So without further ado, I'll just show the video.
China says its social credit system is designed to allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. Critics say this is the government's way of creating a high-tech dystopia, but at least one Chinese company sees social credit as a business opportunity.
其实政府知道它自己需要一些自有的体系，它去提供公共服务里面的相关的一些信用产品，还要把信用体系建设完整，它一定也需要社会资源端的参与。那我们就是众多社会资源参与者之一。
Xi Yanying's company has developed a social credit app. It gives China's youth a taste of the benefits one can have with a good social credit rating. The Beijing startup collaborated with the Communist Youth League of China to gather personal data from over 70 million young people. The app is called Unique Town. It gives each user a score based on 6 criteria: personal information, volunteer work, social connections, credit history, consumption history, and track record of honoring contracts. The lowest score is 350 and the highest is 800. Users with high scores above 650 can benefit by getting discounts on online courses or even be parachuted directly into the second round of job interviews. But China Youth Credit Management has more ambitious goals when it comes to capitalizing on social credit. It wants to build a system to cover all Chinese citizens between the ages of 18 and 45, an estimated 460 million people.
比如说，如果丈母娘是一个喜欢有钱的女婿的话，她就要去关心她的资产状况，对吧？如果一个女孩子她喜欢金融的一个经理呢，就需要关注她的一个从业的背景，可能就是她有比较多的一些借债的一些历史。其实可能我在结婚之前，对方并没有很明确的告知我，但是我们进入婚姻状态之后，我有了一些这个共担风险的一些责任。从数据维度上它是可以支撑的，但这种应用场景我们要不要推出来，可能还需要再去在合法合规性上面去论证。
Such apps appear to confirm the fears of critics who worry that China's social credit system undermines an individual's right to privacy, but she sees it in a different way.
数据本身，肯定是你留痕的数据，无论是企业还是个人，它被用起来才会有价值的。那我们每个人判断一个对外的一个人，都是要有一些轨迹可循的。就是大数据未来肯定是给社会和经济甚至政治领域带来价值，只是你怎么样去用的问题。
Like it or not, China is pressing ahead to have its social credit system rolled out nationwide by 2020, and China Youth Credit Management wants to be at the forefront when it comes to creating the tech to support it.
So that's just a little bit of an intro into the social credit system, which is similar kind of to credit scores here, except it would take into account a much wider variety. It's not merely financial. It could be also, have you been accused of crime? You know, have you made inappropriate speech online? That sort of thing. So the last thing I want to touch on kind of before we have more of a conversation is Xinjiang, which is the province in far western China. I just wanted to do a side-by-side. So this is from last year in 2019 of the search results of YouTube versus Youku, the Chinese streaming site. So if you look, for instance, on the left, that's Youku's search results. Beautiful Xinjiang, a documentary, the most beautiful places in Xinjiang. A Hong Kong girl goes to Xinjiang and records it. And then the other is like a driving trip through Xinjiang. So that's basically all travel documentary kind of style videos. However, the first couple of hits, first 4 hits for Xinjiang in YouTube, one is about allegations that it's a terrorist breeding ground. The other is why is Xinjiang important to China politically? The other is about the internment camps, kind of forced labor and religious persecution. And then finally, it's, you know, a food tour. I mean, it is YouTube after all. I did the searches again this year. So on the left, it's 2 kind of documentaries. One is kind of personal stories of people in Xinjiang. The other is Xinjiang Weidao, so like Xinjiang Taste. It's a cooking show, I imagine. And then on the right, some of these are the same sort of hits. A couple of them are the same. Also, a Vice News documentary. Basically, it's a similar sort of disparity or discrepancy, kind of 2 different kinds of search results you would get depending on whether you were accessing kind of the PRC domestic sites versus sites that are blocked in the PRC. So with that, I guess that's the end of my PowerPoint presentation. Happy to talk about any aspect of it.
Thank you, Liz. That was wonderful. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and reflections and your wonderful research. And in the absence of a live audience, I thought maybe we could have just a one-on-one short dialogue and ask a couple follow-up questions. I guess the big elephant in the room is right now COVID-19. Everyone is at home in China, and I'm assuming internet usage all around the world is exploding. How has COVID-19 impacted the internet in China? How has it impacted, you talked a lot about government control of the internet. Have you seen changes taking place during this time? And I'm just curious your reflection over the last couple of months, what we're seeing on the ground in China vis-a-vis the pandemic.
So one of my, the focuses of my, sorry, you can see my cat's tail here. Out of the frame, out of the frame. One of the focuses of my research is on forced confessions, televised confessions. So I mentioned Charles Xue. I wrote about him a little bit in my book. Since then, I've done kind of research on other confessions that have been broadcast on national or state-run media. A lot of them are rights lawyers or activists. Actually, this did happen during the pandemic. There were several people whose confessions were kind of broadcast on Weibo. They said they had been spreading rumors, you know, they regret it, they won't do it again. So this as a tactic for kind of controlling speech has continued to be kind of a force at play. There's also the doctor Li Wenliang, who famously kind of spoke out, several doctors actually spoke out about kind of initial information that was suppressed for a while. And, you know, Li Wenliang in particular was forced to say, you know, I won't do it again, you know, I messed up. And in retrospect, many people said, you know, if I had known at the time how bad it was going to be, I would have told everyone. Ivan said this. However, you know, I think there was a period where there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the initial censorship efforts, with, you know, not stopping things sooner in Wuhan, like public gatherings, not reporting on human-to-human transmission. And for a time, that was kind of a very, I would say, not unified, but a shared public sentiment. However, and I'm sure you've also experienced this, there's now been more of a backlash against people who are accused of politicizing it, of making it about, just saying bad things about China. So, I think everyone's in agreement that the initial censorship was wrong and more lives could have been saved. But in terms of like anti-censorship sentiment, I wouldn't say it's been replaced by nationalism, but certainly been tempered by it. I don't know if you have thoughts on that as well.
No, I've certainly seen the similar dynamic taking place, that initially I think after the death of Li Wenliang, there seemed to be a liberalization short term, and they allowed some more critical voices, and they actually had a reappraisal of Li Wenliang's place in the whole timeline of the pandemic and his contributions. However, as things have started to return to normal in China, there's also been an incredible rise in nationalist sentiment. And with that rise in nationalist sentiment, I've also seen a kind of real strong arm crackdown on any voices of dissent or those who called for a more thorough investigation into what had happened. It's basically turned into a kind of you're with us or against us type of narrative. At least that's what I'm seeing.
And I think kind of the racism that came about after the pandemic went global fueled that as well. Kind of there was a sentiment of, it really strengthened the us versus them kind of feeling, because, people were being attacked on the street, and, there were people saying things about China broadly, not about like the government or the censorship policies. So it made, I can imagine it made a lot of people think, well, if it's that or, my own national identity, I guess I know which side to pick. And Trump obviously didn't help.
Right.
But
I want to backtrack a little bit into the earlier portion of your lecture where you gave this overview of all of the restrictions and the ways in which this control mechanism of censorship works. But increasingly so, of course, that's a huge part of the overall picture, right? This local Chinese internet, all of these apps, all of these companies are developed so that they can build in this level of censorship that we don't have in, say, Facebook and Western alternatives. But the other side, you mentioned it a little bit, but I think it's such an important topic. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more, and that's the economic ramifications. That is, if you remove Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of these corporate giants, you create a space for these local Chinese startups to explode into massive multi-billion-dollar companies, and that's what they've all done. And so, although censorship may have been the original impetus, to what extent do you think the economic, almost the kind of market protectionism went into creating that system so that these companies could really expand unfettered and unchallenged by Western competitors?
I think you're right. I don't know exactly what the balance is of, it was done to enhance censorship, it was done to promote domestic innovation. It's certainly done both. And I think the more successful these kind of PRC companies have become in the domestic market, the more also they are, the government has more leverage to make sure they enforce censorship mechanisms. So for instance, WeChat is wildly successful. It's like such a huge, Tencent, its parent company, is like so huge, just like hand over fist money all the time. And it has such a monopoly on the domestic market. However, without the domestic market, it's nothing. I mean, certainly Tencent has some business that's outside of the PRC, and there are users outside of the PRC who use WeChat. But if the government said, for instance, we're shutting down your domestic operations, that would be it for the company, which I think gives them a lot more leverage to, say, enforce these censorship mechanisms than, say, a company that has a diversified, let's say, 20% of their users are in the PRC and 20% are in India and so on and so forth. They would just be able to either take the loss or bargain about it. But the fact that these companies are so successful, mainly only within the PRC, means they're also much more beholden or much more kind of at risk from any kind of changing government policy. But a lot of these companies have become super successful, like TikTok. I mean, I don't use it, obviously, I'm old, but it appears to be very popular among the youths. So, you know, that's originally a Chinese company. Chinese PRC companies are also buying kind of other companies to expand their business portfolio. It has promoted a lot of domestic innovation. Although I also will say that kind of the very lax intellectual copyright protections within the PRC have made it difficult for smaller companies to challenge giants like WeChat. So for instance, WeChat's audio messaging function is totally ripped off of another company. But there's not really a whole lot of recourse in a system where, you know, they already have so much power. Although, I mean, that's something that Facebook and Google and everybody does too, like buy up their competitors and before they get to be too big of a threat.
One of the videos you showed kind of gave a profile of how WeChat is this Swiss Army knife, right? It does it all. And although some of these companies began as so-called copycats, they've innovated in such a way that now it's come full circle. And I'm wondering, if we complete the circle, in what ways are you seeing the big American or European social media companies, whether it be Twitter or Facebook, are they starting to change the way they function because of...
You just went out there for a minute.
Oh, sure. Can you hear me now?
You're frozen.
Hello?
Professor Barry?
Yes, can you hear me?
Sorry, you just went out there.
Okay.
You were here when you froze.
I think we're back, yes?
So you were saying comes full circle?
Yeah, and are we seeing companies like Twitter or Facebook starting to incorporate some of the innovations made from WeChat or other Chinese companies into their own platforms? Are we seeing that circle kind of being completed now? I
would say, you know, Instagram and Facebook in particular, I think, have taken a page out of WeChat's book for some of their features. Facebook is trying to like make it itself an all-in-one, and in some countries it's already kind of like the all-in-one internet. You know, people access the internet through Facebook. You can be on Facebook looking at marketplace and like groups and your timeline. I would not say it's as successful as WeChat is as at doing that thing, and part of that is because, you know, it would never be able to, well, I never say never, but I don't think it would be able to achieve that kind of a monopoly on all different kinds of services. But if you think about it, you use Messenger, which is Facebook's Messenger, Instagram, which Facebook owns, Facebook. There's several kind of things. If it continues to acquire and there's no antitrust legislation, it could potentially become that way. But I will say WeChat is very advanced in ways and localized in ways that, you know, the big kind of social media giants here aren't. Just in terms of things like, you know, transcription software, the different in-app purchase features, kind of mobile payment is very strongly incorporated in a frictionless way. So like last time I was in Beijing a year or two ago, you know, I used it to pay every time I went out to a restaurant and, you know, got something from a vending machine. So we're working towards contactless payment in the US, but it's by no means as advanced, you know, as it is with WeChat.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think I will not take any more of your time, but I wanted to again thank you on behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies and also our course, Chinese 40, Pop Culture in Modern China, where this will be running. And thank you again for all your time and your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Liz.